Welcome to our channel, BritNews Update. Today, we're taking a look into the latest royal financial reports. It's a topic that, well, it always gets people talking, doesn't it?
It certainly does. These annual reports always throw up some interesting details.
And this year, one particular thing really grabbed the headlines straight away, the end of the line for the historic royal train.
Yeah, that's definitely a big moment, and it sort of opens up that wider conversation about royal spending, costs, and maybe modernization too.
Okay, so let's start there then. The royal train. It feels like such an iconic thing, almost a symbol. What's its background, and why is retiring it such big news now?
You're right, it is steeped in history. The whole idea goes way back, actually, to Queen Victoria's time. 1869 was the first use. It's not just one train, mind you, it's a set of carriages, historically pulled by whatever locomotive was hired in. And Sky News recently detailed how much Queen Elizabeth II used it, especially later on. It was seen as, safe, convenient for getting across the country. She could even stay on it overnight.
Really practical then, in its day. And now, it's being phased out completely. What's the reason?
Well, Buckingham Palace announced it. The plan is to decommission it fully by March 2027. BBC News reported it pretty clearly as a cost-saving measure. Simple as that, really.
Cost saving. Times Radio even suggested it would become a bit of an embarrassment. Is that fair? Because of the cost?
That was the suggestion, yes, because the running costs were just so high for how little it was used.
Right. How high are we talking? Can you give us a sense of the figures involved?
Yeah, the numbers do make you pause. Times Radio and the BBC both mentioned one trip, just 2 days, costing over £44,000. Another one was around £33,000. And despite that kind of spending, it was only actually used twice last year.
Twice. Wow.
Exactly. And there's another issue that carriages themselves haven't had a major update since, well, the mid-1980s. So they need significant work, huge costs involved there too, which ultimately led to the decision to scrap it.
Though maybe not scrapped entirely. Is there talk of a museum?
There is some talk, yeah, potentially turning parts of it into a museum piece. We'll have to see on that one.
Okay, so the train is going. How does this change how the royal family travels now? And does it tell us anything bigger about their spending? Are they, tightening their belts?
It's an interesting mix, actually. This specific train is out, yes, but they'll still use regular trains, scheduled services. But what's also come out, highlighted by Times Radio and Sky News, is that King Charles is leasing 2 new helicopters.
Ah, okay, so helicopters instead, despite the talk about environmental impact.
Well, that's the dynamic, isn't it? You have this sort of shedding of an old, expensive symbol, the train, which looks like austerity. But at the same time, there's this investment in modern, arguably more efficient travel like helicopters. So it's maybe a bit of both, wrestling with image versus operational needs.
That does seem complex.
Yeah.
Let's broaden out then. Beyond the train, what do the main financial reports tell us about the overall public funding? The sovereign grant.
Right, the sovereign grant. That's the key bit of public money. It pays for the official duties, the staffing, and a huge part is maintaining the buildings like Buckingham Palace. So for this financial year, 2024-25, Sky News reports the grant is $86.3 million.
$86.3 million. That's already a lot of money. But I heard there's a big increase coming.
Yes, that's where it gets really interesting. For the next 2 years, it's set to jump quite dramatically, up to $132.1 million per year.
Wow, 132 million pounds. Why such a big increase?
It's almost entirely down to the Buckingham Palace renovation project. That huge 10-year, $369 million job needs funding to be completed. BBC News really emphasized that point. And they also pointed out something striking. If you adjust for inflation, this level of funding is roughly 3 times higher now than when the sovereign grant system started back in 2012.
3 times higher in real terms.
Okay.
And where does this money actually come from? Is it directly from taxpayers?
It comes via the Treasury, but it's calculated based on profits from the Crown Estate.
Ah, the Crown Estate. That's the portfolio of land and property.
Exactly. It's held by the monarch in right of the crown, so not their private property, but its profits generate the funding. And Sky News reported that the estate has seen massive profits recently, especially, interestingly, from offshore wind farms being built on seabeds it owns.
Wind farms funding the monarchy. That's quite a modern twist.
It is, isn't it? A fascinating link between renewable energy and this traditional funding mechanism.
So, with these really significant costs, especially the increase, how does the palace justify it? What's their argument?
Their main justification revolves around, well, national value and soft power. The keeper of the pretty purse, the chief financial officer, basically made this point quite strongly. As reported by Sky News, the argument is that the monarchy is seen globally as the single biggest influence on perceptions of the UK, bigger than sport, politics, culture, even the economy, they claim.
That's a bold claim.
It is. And they argue this funding ensures essential heritage buildings like the palace are maintained for the nation. The implication being, if the grant didn't cover it, taxpayers would have to fund it some other way anyway.
Okay, let's loop back to travel costs then. The train's gone, but you mentioned helicopters. What's the overall travel bill looking like? Has it gone down?
Actually, no. According to BBC News, the total cost for royal travel this past year was £4.7 million. That's actually up by £500,000 from the previous year.
Up, even without the expensive train for most of the year. How does that break down?
Well, if you look at the breakdown, it shows a heavy reliance on private chartered travel. There were 141 helicopter trips, costing nearly £500,000, £475,000, plus 55 private charter flights, costing almost £600,000. Scheduled flights were much less, about £126,000.
So helicopters and charter flights are the big costs there.
They really are. It points towards, prioritizing efficiency, security, speed, even though there are questions about the cost and environmental side.
Was there one particularly expensive trip that stood out?
Yes, the King and Queen's visit to Australia and Samoa. Sky News and BBC News reported the flights alone for that cost £400,000.
£400,000 just on flights.
Just on flights, yes. Though it's important to note, they did clarify that some parts of that trip were covered by the Australian government and potentially some privately funded elements too. And, alongside these costs, you have to remember the sheer volume of work. BBC News cited over 1,900 official engagements last year, nearly 94,000 guests hosted at royal residences, plus big diplomatic events like the state visit from Qatar.
Right, there's always that context of the duties performed. Now, moving away from the public sovereign grant, what about private income? Prince William and the Duchy of Cornwall, for instance. How much transparency is there?
That's a really important area of the duchies. The Duchy of Cornwall is that separate estate, land and buildings, that funds the Prince of Wales his private life and his public work. Last year, BBC News and Sky News reported that Prince William took $22.9 million from the duchy.
$22.9 million, that's his income from that source. What about tax on that? Is that public knowledge?
This is where the transparency debate often kicks in. Kensington Palace has stated he pays the highest rate of income tax. Voluntarily, it should be said. However, unlike his father King Charles when he was Prince of Wales, they haven't released the specific amount of tax paid. Sky News and Times Radio pointed out this difference in approach. So the declaration is made, but not the exact figure.
Okay. And there used to be criticism about rents charged by the duchies, didn't there? Is Prince William changing anything there?
Yes, exactly. There was criticism, for example, about the king when Prince of Wales charging commercial rents to state bodies like prisons or NHS facilities on duchy land. Prince William seems to be signaling a different approach. He's announced what's described as a modern, socially minded strategy for the Duchy of Cornwall. Times Radio and the BBC reported he plans to waive rents or cut them by 50% for charities and community groups using duchy property.
But not for public bodies.
Apparently not. Public bodies like the NHS will likely continue to pay commercial rates, but it's presented as a move towards making the duchy operate more like, say, a social enterprise, focusing on positive impact.
Interesting shift. Now, all these figures, public grant, private income, they always generate debate. What are the main arguments from people critical of the monarchy's cost, the anti-monarchy campaigners?
They are certainly vocal. Norman Baker, the former Lib Dem MP who's written about royal finances, he described the royal family as extraordinarily expensive. He claimed on Sky News that the crust is at least 10 times higher than other European monarchies, and in his words, it has ballooned over the last 15 years or so.
10 times higher. That's a strong claim. What specifics does he point to? How does he get to that sort of figure?
Well, Baker makes a few points. He draws a stark comparison between the old system, the civil list, which was £7.9 million back in 2011, and this new $132 million sovereign grant figure. He also focuses on things like unique tax exemptions enjoyed by the royals and argues that all the profits from both duchies Cornwall and Lancaster should go straight to the treasury, not to William and the King. Based on his calculations, including things often not in the official reports, he estimates the total annual cost is near £500 million. That was his figure given to Sky News.
£500 million. That's a very different number.
It is. And you also have groups like Republic, the anti-monarchy campaign group. Their chief executive, Graham Smith, told the BBC that royal funding is a scandalous abuse of public money. Smith also emphasizes that the published figures often don't include major hidden costs like security, which is obviously significant but kept separate.
So going back to the train, some might see it scrapping as just tinkering around the edges, given these much larger figures being discussed.
That's definitely an argument made. Sky News touched on the idea that decommissioning the train could be seen as sort of useful distraction, a visible cut, but maybe masking these bigger ongoing costs. And then you have things like the coronation cost. That was estimated around 72 million.
72 million. And how do critics view that sort of expenditure?
Campaigners tend to frame it as just a big PR exercise, arguing it doesn't make real economic sense. They point out that most European monarchies don't even do coronations anymore. They also argue the supposed tourism boost is outweighed by the economic hit from the extra public holiday. The comparison made on Sky News was to Versailles in France, hugely popular with tourists, even though France got rid of its monarchies centuries ago. The argument being, you don't need a living monarchy for heritage tourism.
So, faced with all these criticisms, how does the palace generally respond? What's their forward-looking message?
They tend to stick to that core message about global influence and soft power, the point the keeper of the privy purse made. They also stress, as reported by Sky News, that the monarch is very aware of current cost of living pressures and environmental issues. In terms of concrete actions, don't expect any big sell-offs of major properties like Windsor or Sandringham. That seems unlikely. The focus appears to remain on justifying the public funding they receive, making places like Buckingham Palace open to the public in summer, finding ways to show public benefit and, quote, value for money. That seems to be the ongoing strategy, as mentioned on Sky News.
Okay, one final thought then. What does all this mean for accountability, how the finances are overseen? Is that likely to change?
That's a really crucial question, isn't it? Norman Baker's argument, again on Sky News, is quite pointed here. He argues that since the royal family receives public money and performs public functions, they should be subject to exactly the same rules, accountability, spending controls as any other public body, like the NHS or a local council. His perspective is that currently, they essentially mark their own homework when it comes to finances.
So a call for much stricter external oversight.
Precisely. It raises that fundamental question about whether the current system of reporting and auditing provides enough independent scrutiny for the modern era. It's a debate that's likely to continue.
A lot to consider there. Thank you for tuning in to BritNews Update. Goodbye. See you in the next video.